Hello and welcome to our program. Through the summer, the Watkins Museum of History has an exhibit titled From Then to Now, A Student History of Haskell Indian Nations University. This exhibit was developed in partnership with the Haskell Cultural Center and offers a great window into the history of the school. Haskell was deeply involved in World War I, and it was also one of the first places affected by the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. Additionally, from May 2nd to July 30th this year, we invite you to tour On Two Fronts, Kansans Fighting the Great War, which will be a ticketed exhibit experience, as we're calling it, here at the Watkins. Visit watkinsmuseum.org for details and to get tickets as they become available. In connection with these two exhibits, we've invited historian Thomas Grillot to speak to us about his book, First Americans, U.S. Patriotism in Indian Country After World War I. So, Dr. Grillot, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
So on a technical note, due to the time difference between France and the United States, we've had to make this program a pre-recorded interview instead of a live streamed event. So we won't be able to answer or to address any questions or comments you might have, but we think you'll enjoy this interview anyway. So, Dr. Grillot, I'd like to start off with a question that I'm sure you get asked a lot, but that I'm also sure our audience members are curious about. So how did you become interested in Native American history?
Well, that's actually a very short story. I became interested in Native American studies during a year when I taught French at the University of Washington in Seattle. I had the opportunity of taking graduate classes in Native American history and anthropology. And I really loved the sense that this scholarship was part of a dialogue between various sets of people. I met students of all kinds of backgrounds, specialists of history and anthropology and literature, academics, and people involved in advocacy and activism, and I really loved it. So I thought I want to be part of that. I want to contribute to that, and that's exciting. That's basically it.
Excellent. Well, so in this book, you engage with some of the popular conceptions of Native American military service. So what are these popular ideas that you engage with and in some cases disprove?
Well, I think we tend to always tell the story of Native American participation in the wars of the 20th century in the same light. Which is very moralistic and very heroic and kind of obsessed with the idea of culture. It's a narrative that you can read over and over. Almost every mention of American Indian war service follows the same pattern. American Indians were not citizens. They did not have to fight for the US. They did so in vast numbers and brilliantly. They were super patriots and they were granted citizenship because of it. On top of that, one often hears that their war service should be understood as the continuation of an uninterrupted tradition of warriorhood or of a tradition of defending their land. Now, it looks like a good narrative. It is well-meaning. It honors Native veterans' service. It honors their intentions. It pays tribute to something that Native Americans used to be blamed for, which is their ability to wage wars. This time it's done on behalf of the US, and it's looked upon as a good thing. But I think there's a lot that gets lost in this way of telling history. Take, for example, the idea that American Indians were super patriots, that they enlisted in record numbers ahead of the draft and so on and so forth. For one thing, a lot of it is just a parroting of the propaganda that was put out by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in 1917, 1919. The BIA wanted to be able to say that his quote-unquote Indians were loyal, that they had enlisted in vast numbers, that they were a model minority. And all of this because of the sterling civilizing work that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had done over the years. So it was pretty much done, this way of telling the story, in a spirit of self-justification. Civil servants were saying look, the numbers speak for themselves. We have done a great job. We're good. We're great. Just keep us in business. Because this all happened at a time when a lot of people were talking of getting rid of the Bureau. They were calling it corrupt and inefficient and paternalistic. So in a way, World War I was a godsend for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Now, if we accept this narrative, we forget that American Indians are not a block of people, that there are peoples in the plural and people in the plural too, which means that their reactions to any event will cover a large gamut of reactions depending on local situations, on individual situations even. So when the US joined the Allies in the war on April 6, 1917, indigenous people across the US react in very different ways. First, you have to remember that there's a lot of confusion going on. Nobody knows exactly whether American Indians are liable to be drafted, for example, or even to be registered. Not the Army, not the Bureau of Indian Affairs, not American Indians themselves, and certainly not the white members of the local draft boards. Groups like the Go Shoots, for example, will try to actively oppose registration because they're unhappy with the local agent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's not draft rebellion per se, it's unrest, but it's taken very seriously by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in fact, they have the Army raid the Go Shoot reservation and arrest some of the ringleaders, what they call the ringleaders. On other reservations, there are people who fear that taking part in the war, in any war actually, could be taken as a breach of the treaties that they signed with the US, which were actually peace treaties. Now, you have also those who make a very public demonstration of loyalty, who have their young men enlist ahead of the draft, who take them to the recruiting station or the train station. And it's not culture that speaks. It's collective action. It's pressure from the authorities and from teachers or parents or even from peers. You have to remember that the boarding schools at the time are a recruiting ground. You have young underage people who joined the Army to get away from their teachers, from the classroom. They might believe in the virtue of patriotism. Or they might want to look good in front of their classmates. They have been told that their ancestors were warriors. And they also know that their peers might become warriors before them. So there's a competition there. And sometimes that's even more important in the decision they make than any form of cultural background. That's one misconception. Another one would be the misconception that regards citizenship. You also have to remember that at the beginning of the war, 1917, it is estimated that approximately 2/3 of the American male population already has citizenship, holds citizenship. So the war accelerates the movement to grant citizenship to American Indians. After the war in 1919, you have a new batch of American Indians that receive citizenship, veterans, namely. But the war does not create that movement. And it certainly does not end the story of turning these theoretical rights into a practical one. And what I mean by that is that citizenship does not equal voting rights. The fight for voting rights, for to grant full voting rights to all American Indians across the U.S. does not formally end until the mid-1950s. So when blanket U.S. citizenship is granted to all Native Americans in June 1924, to all Native Americans born in the U.S., it's just a link in a chain that, in a way, reaches into the present day. It's still an ongoing fight.
Interesting. Very, very interesting. So You've already given some examples, but in First Americans, you don't attempt to comprehensively survey the experiences of all American Indians after World War One. So, what tribes and regions do you focus on, and why do you emphasize those?
The idea that one could constantly talk about all American Indians together as a group might, I think, sometimes be counterproductive. I think one needs to focus on certain groups to get a finer sense of what war service meant for those who served. One needs to examine, for example, when one is a historian, specific bodies of archives that are local. One needs to try to reconstitute the history of all these different groups, and it can be very different, very specific. So I decided to focus on the plains in my work because the area is often regarded as the place where the stereotype of the Indian warrior fits the most, is the most ingrained in the quote unquote culture. So the idea was, if I can show that things are more complex on the plains, it might better help loosen the grip of that stereotype. I ended up spending a lot of time on the Standing Rock Reservation, actually, because I found that there, not one, but 6 posts of the American Legion had been founded after World War One. I thought there was something there that needed to be explained. And I found that what explains it is very much a white and Indian dynamic. For better or for worse, the story of veterans is interracial. There are all kinds of forms of collaboration between native and non-native veterans. There are sincere and cynical forms of inclusions of Native Americans in Indian posts. And if you don't look at the local level, you don't see that, because Native Americans rarely make it to the top of the hierarchy in veterans organizations. So if you stay at that level, you just miss that story. But these collaborations matter. They matter because they have real effects on Native Americans' ability to claim their rights as veterans or as citizens. No matter what the intentions of the different parties were, good or bad, the dynamic of collaboration, of inclusion, played a very important part in making it possible for Native Americans to reap at least some benefits of their war service. The bonus, for example, medical assistance on another level, or even help when Native American veterans were trying to get to Washington to claim their rights, to claim rights for themselves or for their tribes or nations. In other words, with the veterans organizations, they had access to a network that they could use to further whatever cause it was that they wanted to advocate for. And that was very precious at the time. It was a way out of the isolation of having to talk always through the Bureau of Indian Affairs only.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes total sense. So, how did Native American World War I veterans use patriotism? And patriotism is the focus of your work, to advocate for their people's rights and cultures. And what are some examples of these cultural products and events that they used to do this?
I think the thing we have to remember is that the people have been thinking about the meaning of their service the minute they were drafted, the minute they volunteered. They rethink the meaning of war constantly, in fact. The minute they enlist, as I said, they start working out explanations and justifications and even preparing speeches, sort of. When they come back from the armed forces, they deliver these speeches and they do so in very divergent ways. Some go after more citizen rights, more assimilations. Others use these rights to do quote unquote traditional things like dances, some of the dances that were actually forbidden at the time. They claimed the right to hold them because of their war service. At the same time, you have very few veterans that actually actively claim citizenship per se, just because they were given it without having to ask for it, and sometimes against their will, because with citizenship, they lost some forms of protection. Now, this takes place via organizations that we're not used to imagining as possibly on the side of Native Americans. Take the American Legion, for example. The Legion was created in 1919, and it almost immediately became a reactionary forces. In 1935, it makes Mussolini an honorary member, the Italian dictator, an honorary member. At the same time, the Legion is the organization responsible for defending veterans' rights. It's the organization that will push for what will become the GI Bill of Rights. And locally, on and around reservations, Legion posts play a very important role in getting people used to the idea that Native Americans are not just warriors, but that they're patriots, they're Americans, and they deserve to be treated as such. And it's a very powerful message. Remember, the Indian Wars are still being commemorated. The hostiles, or so-called hostiles, are still remembered with loathing, fear and loathing in some quarters. At the same time, the celebration of Memorial Day and Armistice Day, what is now called Veterans Day, is an opportunity for Native Americans to mention their great men, their heroes, including the hostiles, and to call them patriots. So sometimes you see the names of people as Sitting Bull commemorated on war memorials along the names of World War I veterans from his tribe. Former enemies of the US end up being celebrated as patriots along US servicemen. Again, I think it's pretty powerful stuff.
Absolutely, it is. So, what were the when I was reading your book toward the end, I was struck by how important the termination laws were. So, what were these termination laws, and how did they change the lives and outlooks of Native veterans?
In a way, termination is on the agenda of many non-native men of power as soon as reservations are created. The idea is this: let's get rid of reservations. Indians don't need the land. We do. And there's a somewhat less cynical version of this. And it goes like this: if we keep reservations, Native Americans will never be able to merge with the US population. They will remain backward and helpless, and so on and so forth. But even though the idea is around, it really becomes a project that's put into practice between 1943 and 1953. The message that Native Americans are citizens and that reservations prevent them from being fully citizens becomes very audible at that time. In the midst of World War II, right at the end of World War II, you start seeing bills in Congress that are designed to emancipate, that's the vocabulary they use, emancipate veterans. And then not only veterans, but all Native Americans. And emancipate means something very specific. It means provide them with the ability to sell their land without oversight, or the ability of being judged in state courts, not by the courts of Indian offenses that were common on many reservations, where they had fewer legal protections. And actually, quite a few Native Americans are tempted by this. For us today, the idea that Native folks could have looked upon termination as an opportunity is anathema. We tend to think that those who did were naive, that they were brainwashed, that they were confused, and we lose the ability to explain why they could have made this choice in full awareness. We forget that the perspective of emancipation, of getting rid of the oversight of the Bureau of Indian Affairs could indeed have looked very tempting. At the time, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was barely starting to loosen its grip on Indian lives. In the 50s, it's still very much a colonial administration. American Indians are citizens, but as I said, in many Western states, they cannot vote. They are restricted in their ability to sell their property. And that restriction has always been meant as a way to protect this property. But pretty early on, you have some Native Americans who have felt that this was an unnecessary limitation imposed on them as individuals. Selling one's property is not just a right, it's a necessity for people who are locked into reservations economies with not many opportunities to earn wages. It's a way to make cash and to build a home or to pay for a medical operation. So restrictions placed on the sale of land are often regarded as an unnecessary burden. Add to that the fact that in the 1950s, many people have started talking about reservations as concentration camps. They have started describing reservation as an abnormal, a monstrous even, legacy of the past. They say Europeans decolonize in Africa or Asia. We should decolonize here. We should get rid of reservations. Beyond these circumstantial reasons, you have a deeper, even older, principled opposition to the Bureau of Indian Affairs that's at play. Specifically in opposition to the setting up of tribal government by the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 30s under John Collier. Many Native American veterans of World War I start their careers in tribal politics at that time, in the 30s. They stand for or against Collier's so-called Indian New Deal. And the majority of politically active Native American veterans actively oppose the Indian New Deal. They see it, and not without reason, I think, as yet another intervention from above, another plan to save the Indians that they can do without. And some of them mobilize patriotic rhetorics and call for the abolition of the New Deal on the basis of their sacrifice in wartime. So for some Native Americans, especially Native American veterans, opposition to the New Deal and later approbation of emancipation or termination makes sense. And it makes sense in terms of their personal experience, of their personal circumstances, and in terms of the principle that they have learned to claim and to use for their benefit. So, of course, the minute these policies start being implemented, there are all kinds of problems that become glaring. States refuse to provide services, Native Americans are not ready to leave their reservations, and so on and so forth. And in the process, the story of how Native American veterans could be part of that movement becomes less audible, even shocking. For some of them at the time, it really did make a lot of sense.
All right. Well, Dr. Thomas Grillot, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today about your research.
Thank you again.
Yeah, absolutely. So
have a great day.
Dr. Grillot's book is First Americans. It's available from from a lot of online booksellers. And thanks to all of you for watching us remotely. If you're in the Lawrence area, we look forward to seeing you at our Haskell and our World War I exhibits. So with that, I'll say goodbye for now.